discuss theism, which is the basic idea about what underlies religion in the sense of who God is, or what God is, and how it's related, how God is related to the world. And I'm going to explain as we get on about what theism is. And so what I wanted to cover today are some of the things about theism. And I'm going to begin by looking at the principles of theism, what exists, and those were briefly discussed in the first lecture, but I'll revise them again so we can see what they are. And then there'll be some, what I call arguments, various short things you can prove from these principles that I've explained. And I want to go through these because many people have ideas about religion and theism which are contradicted by these arguments. So I want to sort of provide a skeleton to the thoughts that I'm going to be presenting later, something rigid which keeps things in shape. There's the argument from being, the argument from life itself, because God is being itself and life itself. And so here's a couple of slides in which I revise what I said in the first lecture as a preview. I'm going to start from the principle that God is a person who is these list of things here: necessary being, unselfish love, and wisdom, and therefore life itself. Each of those things is not so much part of, as I said earlier, a standard philosophical theism, but I think it's part of most people's idea in religion to have an idea of God as having these properties. And you can, in the first lecture I showed how you can justify each of these properties from your preferred Holy Scripture, so to speak. And the result of it is that God enlivens the world. I'm not saying that God creates the world and lets it run by itself, but God creates the world and then continues to keep it going by providing it with life. That's what I mean by enliven. And I can now go into these principles in a little bit more detail to spell out more clearly. And I left out the important one, so I put a principle 0 here, which is that God exists and God is one. Okay, this is the principle which is the very beginning of a religious understanding. You have to believe that. And that God is one of the principles of monotheisms. So I'm addressing religion, or the basis of religion, from the point of view of Judaic or Christian or Islamic monotheism. Then I said God is love, and now I want to say love which is unselfish and cannot love itself. Furthermore, it cannot love only itself. That's not such a strong proposition, but it's all we need here. But I actually believe that from Swedenborg that God cannot love himself at all. And now a number of Christians disagree with that, and so there's some discussion we could come back to later. The second principle, the third one on the list, is God is wisdom, as well as love. And furthermore, we normally think that our understanding or our illumination or our wisdom comes when we receive it from God. And I won't have so much time to explain this aspect, but I might discuss it next week in a bit more detail. So God is wisdom as well as love. And once you have love and wisdom together, then you have the capacity for action, for wise action. Love wants to produce the action, and wisdom just shows how to produce the action. So then you have the power and the action that follows from that. Now, if we summarize all of those things together, we say that God is life itself. And I will discuss later on what exactly life itself is, but I'm going to summarize, I'll say it here, it's the source of all dispositions to will, think, and act. So every love, every understanding, every action we have comes originally from God. And so the challenge is to understand that, how that works, because if we look at ourselves, it doesn't appear that all our life and wisdom and understanding comes from God, but theism is an explanation, a deeper explanation of what the fundamental causes are. And then we end with everything in the world as a kind of image of God. In other words, I said earlier, an image of God as us as a whole and all of our parts. So that means all our minds, all our natural objects of all kinds, each of these are images of God. But they're not all images of God in the same way, so we have to discuss that. And then finally, our life derives from divine power. So God is life itself, but He is the source of life for everything in the universe. Every animate, inanimate, every conscious, unconscious thing in the universe has life or power that comes from God in some way. And as I said, this list was suggested by Emanuel Swedenborg in this book, Divine Love and Wisdom. So my talks can be regarded as a preliminary discussion in order to begin to understand this book of Divine Love and Wisdom. So now we come to some simple arguments, and you can use the principles that we have so far. And the first one is that God is being itself. We want to understand what that means. Now, it's clear that we exist, people exist, we exist, created beings exist. And another way of saying that we exist is that we have being. Our being exists. But God is being itself, so therefore that implies some relation between our being and God and the being of God. And so if God is being itself, what I take that to mean is that our being either is God or depends on God. That's what we mean by, if God is being itself and we have being, it means that our being comes from God. Either that, logically speaking, either we are God already or our being comes from God. And the fact that our being comes from God is the basic principle of theism. It distinguishes theism from deism and non-dualism and other monistic views. In theism, God is the source of us. But this here says that either we're God or depends on God. It doesn't distinguish, the logic doesn't as yet distinguish between us being God or depending on God. In order to do that, we have to have another argument, which is based on the fact that God is unselfish love. God is love which is unselfish. And as I said, I believe unselfish love cannot love itself. That means that we must be distinct from God. Because if we're not distinct from God, then we'll be the same as God, and therefore God would be loving himself when he loved us. So the simple fact of God's love being unselfish tells us that God is not us. That is, we are separate from God in some way. So this basic fact can be used for discussion with, say, the non-dualists, which you may have met from a variety of religious ideas or spiritual ideas, that we are all part of the whole. God is everything that is. But if God is unselfish love, then you can argue that we must be in some way separate from God. And if you talk to these people, most of them will admit that God is unselfish love because they don't want to say God is selfish love. And so therefore, there's a way of discussing with them about whether we're the same as God or not. And so that means we don't have pantheism. Pantheism is one of the versions or the relatives of theism. Pantheism is when everything is a part of God. Now, the non-dualists often say that we are really part of God, but it's an illusion that we think we're separate from God. This is one way that the non-dualists address the fact that we don't appear to be part of God. But this argument about unselfish love is an argument from how things appear from the side of God, not from the side of us. In the sight of God, we must be separate from God. And God presumably sees things how we are, and therefore it can't be an illusion that we're separate from God, because God doesn't have illusions. So if you're going to use the illusion argument, if the non-dualists are going to use the illusion argument, then it has to be an illusion from God's point of view, which is a very strange way of doing it. Another argument that we can use is that God cannot create another God. Because some people think, when they look at the world and they see all the flaws in the way the creation is made, and they say, why couldn't God just create many gods and everyone will be happy, they will be perfect, and they'll all be completely lovable, they do all the right thing. why doesn't God just create lots of little gods and we're maybe those little gods? But in fact, the arguments, the principles that we've started with so far don't allow there to be another God. You might have some idea from the fact that God is one, but maybe the one God is split into many pieces. That's how you could have little gods. But in fact, let us suppose that God did create something that lived in itself. In other words, there was a self-sufficient being that went about its daily life and didn't depend on the original God in any way. Then this being that was autonomous and self-sufficient would have as one of its attributes life itself. It would have life in itself because it wouldn't depend on God. But life itself is one of the attributes of God, one of the ways of describing God. And if life itself is God, that means that this independent being, which we thought was independent from God, had what actually was God because it had life in itself, and life in itself was God. And then, since God is one, we conclude that that thing wouldn't be distinct from God. In other words, life itself is God, and everything that lives must be either dependent on God or be God. It's the same argument as with being. All these itselfs that we had, life itself, love itself, wisdom itself, all of these mean that things that have being, life, love, or wisdom, either they are God or they are dependent on God. And if they're dependent on God, they're not equal to God. They're separate. So all of these arguments about starting from the idea of God that we have here, we can show the basic structure of theism, that God is the source of life, love, and wisdom, and we are separate from the source, but we depend on the source in some way. So the question is how we depend on the source. We'll come to that. And so that means all these arguments are proving from the starting points that we have that we do exist distinct from God. And you can just take it from a rather simple point of view. If God loves us unselfishly, we must be distinct from God, because if we weren't, it wouldn't be unselfish love. And this comes back to the prospect of creating little gods again. God cannot create beings who live in themselves. See, Plato, the Greek philosopher, thought that souls had life in themselves. This was his idea of the soul of everybody. But we see from these arguments that in the theistic framework, Plato's soul those souls would actually be God, because God is life itself, and if you have life itself, you have God in you. And so we conclude by saying that little gods cannot be created. So all of these arguments are sort of reinforcing the idea of theism, showing the relation between God and us. There's a dependence, but a separation at the same time. And so our challenge is to understand that in more detail. Many times I've mentioned life itself, and I said I've mentioned one definition earlier on, but I'm now going to be more specific. Life itself is the most original generative disposition. This is using the ideas from last week, that gives rise to its capacities and actions. In other words, it's the original source of life. And God is life itself. In other words, the original source of all powers and capacities and dispositions. So life is being used in a general way. It's not just referring to human life or to animal life, but it refers to the life of inanimate matter, because inanimate matter has capacities for action. So every capacity or power to do anything, the ability of an electron to repel another electron, is one of its capacities for action, and all of these powers and capacities derive from God in some way. And so the challenge, again, is to understand how. And so, how do we live? Our being in life depends on God. Now, our being in life depends on God, but then there's the question of what in our life is actually our own. Because if everything depends on God, are we practically God? But I'm going to say that our actions are our own. We are free. We want to choose when to act, which will come to that. So I'm going to say that if God is at the top and all the actions, all the powers in between, and then as a result, we have events or actions in the physical world. These actions, I'm going to say, are what are distinctive and unique to us. You can call it our book of life, or the history of ourselves. It's the set of all these actions. And the question is how we receive the life from God in relation to the actions that we've taken in the past. And I'm going to have this general principle, which I'm going to explain in a little bit, but I want to say the general principle is that the life we have is derived from God in accordance with what we've already done. So we receive life from God in a way which depends on what we've already done. And I'll explain why God should act in this manner. Because this is sort of the principle of operation of God with respect to the universe. And it may seem obvious, but the clearest explanation was from Swedenborg, and many people don't fully agree with this way. They think that God has completely arbitrary power to make us, or to remake us, or to destroy us and recreate us all at once. But if you do that, then there's no history, and this doesn't really work very well. But the reason that God gives us power in accordance with what we've already done is that so that we can choose when to act. So I'll discuss this in more detail. But the purpose of it is that we want to enjoy our actions. If we do something that's nice, even just having a drink, it feels nice, we want the feeling of delight to correspond at the same time as our action, or just after, in direct relation. So in other words, it appears to us that when we do something and feel the delight, that it's our own delight. Because you can imagine a dictator of the universe forcing everyone to do things, and if the delight was delayed or at a different time from the action, then people wouldn't like to act. They wouldn't feel as though that was themselves acting. They wouldn't feel free. They'd feel compelled to act, and then the delight might come later. And it's very important to God that we enjoy our actions. This is one of the comes from the fact that his love of us is unselfish. So he wants us to enjoy things the same way that he enjoyed them, but he wants us to feel our enjoyment. He wants us to appropriate to ourselves the enjoyment of our actions. And this means that the delight, the powers that come from God, must be connected to our actions. They must be at the same time as the actions, or clearly in relation to our actions. And now I'm going to explain what this means in terms of the ideas from last week. We're going to say that our actions... Lost it there. Our actions are the occasional cause, and God's life is the principal cause. The principal cause is the power that produces the effect, and the occasional cause are the circumstances that are the necessary conditions for the principal cause to operate. So you remember last week when I talked about something being a selection in a generation? So God's life generates all our action, but our actions are the selections of what life has produced. And if the world is organized like this, then our actions are the occasional cause. It appears to us is that our actions give rise to feelings and thoughts. We see things in the world, we have an idea which comes from that. It appears to us as though our life follows immediately from our actions. But in fact, our actions are only the occasional cause. They're only the occasion for God to act. And This is the simplest way of seeing the relation between God and the life of the world in theism. It's actually a bit more complicated than that, as you might guess, but this is the simplest way. This is the simplest view that I talked about last week, the two-level view of God and action, this occasionalism of Malebranche. But there are things in between, but these two facts are the basis of, I claim, of seeing how theism works in the world. Now, you remember I said God was love itself, and then wisdom itself, and these were the two principles. And then I said on the basis of that, God is power and action. So there's like a little trinity there, but it's a trinity within God. Okay, it's not a trinity of gods, but it's a trinity within one person. We can think of a picture of a person. We can think of Christ as a person in which there is this trinity, but in fact it applies not just to Jesus as he was living on earth, it applies to God before he created anything. He had this trinity there. And you can interpret that in various ways in different religions. But the way I want to interpret it here is that love is the power or the substance of God, wisdom is the form or the shape or the understanding of God, and action is the resulting act that follows from God. And so this threefold structure of God, a trinity within God, is very important because we are going to be images of God in the same way. And now, for my next slides, I'm going to show some complicated pictures. So why don't you take one and pass it along. I'm going to start with images of God. So we'll wait until you just take one sheet and then pass the remaining ones on. I'll take some and pass it to the back here. Okay, so if you find the first one there, slide, I think I've numbered them correctly, slide 13, is images of God. And I've now, on the sheet, I've put down the 4 next transparencies because, as you can see, there are tables there that get a little bit complicated. I'm going to walk you through these tables when we get to them. So let's coming back to the first one, images of God. And I'm going to explain the general principles of how I understand the world to be images of God. All the world and all its part is a kind of image of God. And furthermore, we are images to a greater or lesser extent, because some people take the fact that humans are in the image of God, as presented in the Bible, only to refer to some aspect of human beings. And that certainly, there's a sense in which that is true, but I want to generalize it and say there's another sense in which it is true of all animals, all plants, all minerals, all atoms. They're all, in some way, an image of God. Because if you just look at humans and animals, there's an enormous similarity between the internal structures of humans and of animals. We believe animals have feelings and thoughts, perceptions and desires. All of these things follow. They may not have the rationality that we think humans have or ought to have, but I still think everything in the world is an image of God. And then I'm going to state this sentence here, which doesn't quite make sense yet, but I'm going to say that love and wisdom and action in God are unified and continuous, but we'll see that in us they're spread out into separate parts, and I'll explain what those parts are. But the important thing is that there is in us images of God, of love, wisdom, and action. So that's the thing to remember. Everything, us as a whole, and us in every part, has a threefold image in it. Okay? So we have the idea of hands. This is the original idea of hands. Now, earlier on, I said that we have to be able to choose when to act. Okay, this is an important way in which God gives us life, so that we can choose when to act, and then the delight of action follows from that action when we choose. You must all know that if you've been asked to do something, it's much more pleasurable if you choose when you do it, rather than rely on, follow it immediately when someone else tells you to do it. A measure of a job's autonomy or seniority is when you can choose what actions to do and not just be told all the time exactly what to do at each stage. It's a general feature of human life that freedom follows from the sense of being able to choose what to do. And the reason for this is to enjoy our actions. But that means that if we are to receive life from God and act when we want, then we have to receive life from God and keep it for a while and then use it when we want to. This is the life we receive from God is not used immediately. It has to be taken into ourselves in some way. It has to be stored at least for a little while, and then the life is going to be used when we think we want to use it. It's like food, you know. We don't only do things at the same time as we're eating. We ingest food, we store the energy from food, and then we act as a result of that energy. But we receive something like love and something like wisdom and something like action or power from God, and this means that there has to be separate containers, in some sense, separate containers for love, wisdom, and the means to action. So we receive life from God. That life is not us. We're always the recipients of life. This is the sort of something in a cup. This is the image, or blood in our vessels. That is an image of the way God's life lives within us. So we receive life, but we have to be able to store it and then use it. And the point is that these are then combined when we choose. And so we have to see what in us is the reception of love, what in us is the reception of wisdom, and what in us is the reception of means to action, and see if we can understand what those are from what we know already. And cooking, ingredients for cooking is an image of how this might work. We have 3 ingredients. We receive love, wisdom, and means to action, and we receive these ingredients, and then they act when we decide to act. And this reception in Swedenborg is also called influx. So influx of life or love, wisdom, power into us, and then we receive it. Influx is from the source, and it's reception on our point of view.